Hello and welcome to EIT Health Summit Series 2020. We have got some attendees starting to join us, which is fantastic. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Sarah Price. I'm your moderator for this session, and I'm very lucky to be joined by Julie Mass, who is Product Manager at ArtiQ. Thank you for joining us today, Julie.
Thank you for having me, Sarah. Very happy to be here today.
So Julie and I we've done a few sessions today. So this is our final one. They have been so interesting. So I have to say you're in for a real treat. And we would really love to hear your questions. We've got some good time at the end for some questions and answers. I'm sure when you're watching through, you will have some, because what you'll see is so innovative. I have to say, I've really enjoyed it. So yeah, there's a Q&A box at the bottom here that you'll see. Pop your questions into there. We'll go through them at the end. Feel free to put them in there the whole way through the session. You won't disturb us, it's fine. And don't be shy. This session is recorded. These sessions are recorded. They will be available on the EIT Summit platform, so you'll be able to see them there as well. Let your colleagues and friends know. So let's see, we've got a good amount of attendees here at the moment. So what I'll do is pass you over to Julie, who is going to give us this presentation. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. So yeah, very happy to introduce to you all ArtiQ and what we are doing at ArtiQ today. So ArtiQ is a spin-off university from the University of Leuven, and we are focused on the development of artificial intelligence applications for respiratory diseases, and so lung diseases. And why are we focused on respiratory diseases? That is because they are a major health challenge today. There are over 500 million patients worldwide suffering from a respiratory disease, and 1 out of every 8 deaths is related to a lung condition. With that, of course, comes the crisis of today with the COVID pandemic that is also again affecting the respiratory system. Now, if we look at the tools that doctors have available, the main tool that they're using to evaluate the respiratory system and to measure the functioning of your lungs are pulmonary function tests. Now, these pulmonary function tests are used in several settings. They're used by medical practitioners to diagnose and to follow up on lung diseases. On the one hand, in the hospital, where there's a complete set of pulmonary function tests available with large and complex equipment, but also at the general practitioner, where spirometry is a very simple test that is very often performed to measure the lung function of a patient. That same test is also typically used in clinical trials by pharmaceutical companies to measure and prove the effect of a new treatment. So when we focus on the use by medical practitioners first, then we see that the main issue there is the interpretation. So this slide shows you a typical report of a pulmonary function test. You see there's a massive amount of numbers available. There is several curves where each shape means something different. And so it's a very complex and broad report. So it's easy from this example to understand that the interpretation takes time, that you need to be an expert to do that interpretation in a complete way. But even then, we see that there's a high variability between the different experts in their interpretation, and that often the conclusions are not specific enough to already give a diagnosis. Now, for patients, this means that it takes a long time for them to get to their final diagnosis. Often this goes hand in hand with a lot of additional tests that they need to undergo. And in the meanwhile, sometimes patients even get a wrong diagnosis and a wrong treatment. So we had a look at how big this problem actually is, and we did a study in 16 hospitals across 5 European countries where we used 50 patient cases that we gave to 120 pulmonologists. and we asked them to do the interpretation of those pulmonary function tests. So next to the time that they spent to this and how well their protocol or their description was in line with the international guidelines, we also looked at how well are they in correctly identifying which disease this patient has, to already from the first test identify which disease these patients will be diagnosed with in the end. And so there we saw that an individual pulmonologist on average only has a diagnostic accuracy of about 45%, so less than half of the cases. We also said that there's a huge amount of variability between the experts. And then we looked at the cases where the pulmonologists indicate that they are confident in the answer they give. And as expected, the accuracy goes up, but only slightly. Still only in 52% of the cases, they are able to accurately predict the final diagnosis of that patient. So that is why we worked on a solution and developed the software ArtiQ PFT. It's an artificial intelligence-based software that automatically processes PFT data and then generates a comprehensive report for the pulmonologist. First part of the report is a protocol. So it's a description of the lung function according to the international guidelines. It's translating all those numbers and graphs into sentences. Then the second part is where the core intelligence of the software is, where we use artificial intelligence to calculate how probable it is that this specific patient with this specific lung function has a certain disease. And so here you see a couple of examples how that could look for a pulmonologist. And then in the final part of the report, we provide some conclusions and give some suggestions for next steps on this patient. Software is already CE marked, and since we started in the first Belgian hospitals, we've done over 60,000 interpretations already. So what is the impact, or what can be the impact of this software? When you remember the study we showed before, we now gave the same cases also to the ArtiQ PFT software. And we could see, if we focus on the diagnostic accuracy, we can really see that the software is able to predict the correct diagnosis in 82% of the cases. And then if we look at where the probabilities are high, so where the software is confident, this even goes up to 98% of the cases where the software is accurately predicting the final diagnosis of the patient. So this is really giving us the confidence that the software can make a huge impact to support pulmonologists in doing the interpretation of the test. So then if we move on to the other use case that we talked about before, the clinical trials, there we see that the main issue is equality control. And that is because spirometry is used to measure endpoints and is used to measure inclusion and exclusion criteria. So measuring correctly is critical, and you want to get consistency in those results. And we know that when you use spirometry, the way that you do the test maneuver is critical, that it's done well to get reproducible and accurate results. And so that is why currently in clinical trials, most of the pharmaceutical companies will use a manual centralized overreading service. People, experts that are looking at the data and looking at the curves and then indicating, yes, this is a good test, or no, this is a bad quality test. Like any manual process, it's a very costly process. It's costing several hundreds of thousands of euros per trial often. Of course, it takes time. Someone needs to look at it. Typically, we see a turnaround time of about 48 hours to give feedback back to the testing center. And then you have variation between the different reviewers. So that all leads to some challenges for the clinical trial. You sometimes have to ask patients to come back to the hospital so that when their test was not test feedback came back that it was not good, you need to call them back to the hospital to redo the test. But often actually at that point, you already took a decision on recruitment or randomization. And so still bad data is getting into the trial. And so to solve that, we developed what we call ArtiQ, which is automating the quality control. So we use artificial intelligence to provide immediate feedback and to provide consistent feedback. And in that way, we can reduce the amount of revisits because you can keep the patient in the hospital until you have confirmation on a good quality of the data. And you can wait to make your decisions, your important decisions on recruitment and randomizations until you have confirmation on good quality data. And all of that leads to making sure that only clean data enters the trial. Now, how does that work in practice? You have a patient blowing into the machine, performing the spirometry test, and then less than a second later, the technician that is guiding the test will immediately get a detailed report on, is this a good test or not? And if not, what is the reason? What criteria from the international guidelines is not being met? And so that you immediately can take that information on board when you would redo the test. Now, of course, we had to do excessive validation as with any medical software. And so we used a lot of validation set, international large validation sets to do that. And from that, we feel really confident that this technology can make sure that only high quality data is going into the clinical trial. So this is an overview of the two most important things that we do at ArtiQ today. Now, how do we have business models around this? I think the most important part when you talk about business models is to think who is benefiting, because those are the people that could be your payers. If we look at the last example of the ArtiQ service, where we provide quality control for clinical trials, it's a rather simple model because you have the pharmaceutical companies who will benefit from the added speed and consistency of the quality control. You have the pharmaceutical companies that will benefit from cost savings from transforming a manual process into an automated process, and they are used to pay already today for a quality control service. So this is really an example where you have a very clear one stakeholder with the biggest benefit. Now, if we look at our other product, the ArtiQ PFT, where we're interpreting pulmonary function tests and providing diagnosis support, there's a lot more stakeholders there, and it's a lot more complex. I will, for the sake of time today, not speak about the patients and the PFT equipment vendors, who are very important stakeholders as well. I will talk about the hospitals. Hospitals benefit from using the software. They are the users of the software by reducing the turnaround time for their patients and by reducing operational costs. They also, which is very important in the current situation, use the time of their doctors and their specialists on patient care and not on paperwork or administrative tasks. And again, depending on the healthcare system and the reimbursement strategy in the region, they could benefit from fewer additional tests for specific patients. So this is a very classical model where the user is the buyer and you have very straightforward system. Now then, if you look at other players in the market, there are pharmaceutical companies that are also actually benefiting from the use of this software. Because as we've seen before, the software can really support an early disease detection, can make sure that you get onto a right diagnosis earlier. And so that would mean also getting to a treatment earlier, which is where the pharmaceutical companies benefit. When you can assist more accurate diagnosis, that will also lead to the treatments being more successful because you're only treating the right patients, and it can again lead to a better treatment adherence. Now then, the last player I want to talk about today are the health insurances. The way that they benefit from an earlier diagnosis and a correct diagnosis is that patients get the right treatment, and in that way costs can be avoided on disease progression. For example, we know for COPD, a very important lung disease, that if you diagnose patients early and put them on a correct treatment, you can avoid hospitalizations. Again, then on the fewer additional tests, they could benefit depending on how the reimbursement strategy in the country or with the insurance company is working. So you can see that these two players, the pharmaceutical companies and the health insurances, at first glance, they seem to have nothing to do with the software that is being used at a hospital. But then if you look at it deeper, we actually see that there is a huge benefit for these players here. And I want to give you one example of that, where we worked with ArtiQ PFT and a pharmaceutical company. And so the example is coming from an EIT health program that was running earlier this year called Startups Meet Pharma. And there we had Boehringer Ingelheim, who was launching a challenge to improve the diagnosis of interstitial lung disease, because they have a drug, they have a treatment for that disease. Now, what is going wrong with diagnosis of interstitial lung disease today? Many things. It typically still takes 2 to 3 years from the first symptoms of the patient to get to a final diagnosis. We also know that treatment today can only slow down disease progression. So in those 2 to 3 years, every damage that has been done cannot be gained back, cannot be reverted anymore. We also know that patients live typically 3 to 5 years after their diagnosis still. So from this, you can easily see that an early and improved disease detection is not only significantly impacting patients' life, but also the revenues of the companies that have treatment options. And so that's why today we are discussing and trying to set up a pilot project to prove that value to, on a first-hand, pharmaceutical companies, but we're also thinking about already how can we in a second step or in a later stage also prove this value to the health insurance companies. And so with that example, I want to thank you again for giving me the opportunity to share our story today, and I look forward to any questions that you have for me.
Thank you so much for that, Julie. That was so interesting. I just wanted to reach out and let everybody know that now is the time. You can ask us some questions, pop them in that box there. I mean, I've definitely got some questions. Actually, one bit really stood out to me, that it's 150 minutes to read the test from an expert, but 10 seconds using ArtiQ.
Yeah, well, the 150 minutes is for 50 tests, but that is, let's say 50 tests is the typical hospital day rate of tests. So that is indeed 2.5 hours that you have a pulmonologist and an expert, highly paid physician spending on reporting and looking at numbers, and most of the time just writing the report, actually.
Yeah, no, that was absolutely incredible. It really stood out to me, the data that you've got. So thank you. Especially in a year like this year, where it's been, no one expected this, I don't think, with COVID-19, and especially the impact that that's had with hospitals all over the world, and with ArtiQ being involved, especially in respiratory, and COVID having an impact on that area. Has this meant that that's had an impact on yourselves at ArtiQ?
Yes, definitely. So yeah, in the beginning of the year, we were very focused on hospitals and bringing our solution to those hospitals. Now, in the first wave, first of all, hospitals became unavailable to talk to just because they were so busy and overwhelmed. But also the pulmonary function tests, where the departments were shut down at a maximum, only emergency tests were done, just to allow time for the COVID patients. And so at that time, we started looking, it really allowed us to take a step back and look at the broader ecosystem and think, okay, who else is actually benefiting from this software and from the use of this software, especially because we see that having been closed down for regular care has had a huge impact on the financial situation on a lot of hospitals. So it's a very difficult time today to sell to hospitals. And so we've really taken the time in that period to take a step back and really look at, okay, who else are the players in the market? And I think on the long term, we will benefit from that.
I mean, absolutely. And it's the data that you're sharing is incredible. So clearly this software, we can see what it can do. So it's brilliant you've been able to take this year and look at other directions, which I'm sure you would have eventually, but this has kind of made you kind of really come through and look at that now. So with it being a software, does there need to be any specific machine or equipment or anything that somebody needs to be able to use that?
Yeah, so what we've chosen to do is to only use input parameters that are being measured by all the different equipment brands out there, so that we only use very standardized measurements to go into our algorithm. And we've also chosen to work with a cloud system that we can connect to the hospitals to. And in that way, we can really be independent on the equipment vendor. And I think especially as a startup, showing that to investors, that you don't depend on one big player or the support of a specific player, I think that's very important in our phase of the company.
Yeah, and very transparent as well. Monica, thank you so much for asking a question. So how can you train an algorithm if 50% of the time the doctors are making a wrong diagnosis? How do you know to choose the right sample data to be able to train it? Great question. Thank you, Monica.
Yeah, an excellent question, because we didn't have time today to go in detail, but how we do that is the data that was used to train the model. For those patient cases, we didn't only have the pulmonary function test equipment, pulmonary function test results, we had all other sorts of test results as well. We had a CT scan or a response to treatment. We had really the whole patient journey. And then we put together panels of experts, so panels of pulmonologists who looked at pulmonary function test data, but also the complete file of that patient, how they react to treatment, maybe the CT scan that they've had, and all other tests. And that's how we determined those panels then of 20, 25 pulmonologists, then decided on what was the right diagnosis. And so it's really, yeah, what we're then doing is actually showing to the algorithm, when we're training it, only the pulmonary function test data, so the data that you have at the first visit of that patient, and the final result. And that is how you can be much more accurate than a pulmonologist would be at that first time point on its own. I don't know if that answers your question, Monica.
Monica said that makes sense. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, great.
We've got a few more minutes if anyone else would like to ask another question. I just had another question for you as well, Julie, just in case we don't have any more come through. With the software, have you seen it particularly excel in any disease areas, and have you found anything a challenge?
Yeah, indeed. We see that different diseases leave a more distinct or a more subtle fingerprint, let's say, on lung function data. And one of the things we've seen is that across the different disease groups, we've always been consistently better than the individual pulmonologists. But we do see that there are diseases that are easier to recognize based on lung function data than others. For example, the interstitial lung disease, although it's a rare disease, so it's difficult for pulmonologists, we see that the software can pick it up very well. Then there's other diseases who are much more subtle. For example, there are diseases that are let's say deformations of your thorax or of your back that are causing any lung or breathing problems. Those are much harder to detect on lung function.
That makes complete sense. Right, well, we're actually sadly out of time, but thank you so much. This has been so interesting. It's great to see startups with such innovative breakthrough ideas and software. So thank you everyone who has attended. Thank you so much, Julie, for your time today and your presentation. As I mentioned before, this recording will be on the EIT Summit platform, and wish you all a really great afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.